All right, welcome everyone to our January Facts and Snacks webinar. When you hop on, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, that would be really helpful for us. All right, I'm just letting a few more people in. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, and if you're able to go ahead and mute yourselves, that would be wonderful. If not, I will be able to do that on my end as well. I'm going to go ahead and put some things in the chat. So if you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, you can put your name, your pronouns, your organization. That would be wonderful. And just know that during the webinar, we're going to go ahead and have our presenter screen share once we get all set up. And I'm hoping that you all are able to see the ASL interpreter pinned, as well as our presenter, Mark Deaton, pinned. And for other folks, I'm going to go ahead and turn off your video unless you're able to do that yourselves. That way, we will make sure that we have the maximum visibility for folks who are watching either live ASL interpretation or the recorded ASL interpretation. Go ahead and get that going. All right, if you all wouldn't mind introducing yourselves in the chat again, name, pronouns, organization, that'd be wonderful. And also please select everyone on your drop-down menu, so that way everyone can go ahead and see what you've shared in the chat. Okay, and we are also recording in Spanish and in English for this webinar, just so you're all aware. And Mark, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and sharing your screen while I talk about the tech setup, and then I'll go ahead and introduce you and we'll get started. Okay.
Can everybody see that?
Looks good.
Okay.
Looks good. I just want to go ahead and check, can someone who is not on the Violence Free Colorado staff type in the chat what you're seeing on your screen as far as the slide and how many people you're seeing on your screen? If you're seeing all of the folks or not. I just want to make sure we're pinning appropriately. I know you all might think that the other person's doing it, but no one has typed it. So if someone wouldn't mind just letting me know in the chat. Let's see, you can see the slide and the gallery by choice. Okay. And all right, let's see, I want to make sure. Go ahead. Okay, here we go. This should work. All right, yes, you all can change your view up in the upper right-hand corner if you would like to do that. Thank you so much, Susie. I appreciate that, as well as Linda. That's helpful. Okay, so a couple things I want to let you know before we get started is that we are recording this webinar and we will send out the recordings plus the slides. We are going to be using the chat for questions today, obviously for introductions too. So anytime you have a question, please type that in the chat and I will go ahead and keep an eye on that for Mark, and we'll make sure we answer questions as we go along. If you would like to turn on captions, you can go ahead and turn those on at the bottom of your screen. Click the CC button and you should be able to enable captions. If you would like to enable the Spanish channel, you can go ahead and click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. Okay. If anyone has any questions or needs the ability to pin, like for example, pinning the ASL interpreter, if that is something that you need on your end, please message me in the chat and let me know, and I can give you that permission. And also, we will have a brief poll at the very end of the webinar. So those are kind of our tech highlights, and we're going to go ahead and get started and learn about Colorado's Lethality Assessment Program with Mark Deaton. Thank you so much, Mark, and welcome.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for having me here today and to be able to present this to the group. So I'll start by, I don't know many of you. I was looking through the list. I know a few of you on the call today. My name is Mark Deaton. I'm currently the state coordinator for the LAP program here in Colorado, which has been this position has been in existence for about a year now, and I'll get into more details about that. My background briefly is I was a police officer for 16 years with the Longmont Police Department. I worked for 10 of those years in the detective division, where I was assigned to the domestic violence unit. So that was the bulk of my work in my law enforcement career in and around Boulder County predominantly. I currently work for the University of Colorado in the Center for Study and Prevention of Violence. That's kind of my full-time job as a research assistant on various other violence prevention things going on. And then I also run the state program. So that's briefly about me and my background. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about the background of LAP, sort of where it came from. I know a lot of you are probably very familiar with it, but just to give a brief overview, what it is, where are we kind of going with it in the state of Colorado specifically, and how to get involved if you wanted more information, and how to get involved with me and working through like how we're sort of designing it to be, since this is a new program for the state, more of a state wide focus instead of just agency by agency. So, and then at the end, we should have plenty of time for questions. I'm not sure exactly how long this will be, but we should have plenty of time for questions. As it might have been mentioned, and I might have missed it, if people have a question, Brandy's going to be nice enough to monitor the chat. So if there's something specific that comes up around what we're talking about, we can go ahead and ask some of those questions as well. You don't have to wait till the end. So, and I just wanted to check in with the interpreters. Am I talking too fast, or is that a decent pace? Okay. All right. So the origins of the LAP, for those of you that know, it really grew out of research done by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who's with Johns Hopkins from the danger assessment, which has been around for a number of years. But back in 2003, the state of Maryland wanted to look at making the danger assessment simpler, for lack of a better term. So they established a lethality assessment committee in 2003, which included Dr. Campbell and some of her other researchers from her danger assessment work. Out of that committee grew what we currently have, which is the Lethality Assessment Program, which is an 11 questions in a screen, and we'll talk through how the program works, but that's what kind of grew. They started it in 2004 in 3 different jurisdictions in the state of Maryland as a pilot program. And then they started implementation more on a larger scale in October of 2005 in more jurisdictions than the pilot program. So it was designed to be, it's an evidence-based response to intimate partner violence, which their 2 main focuses at the time were the prevention of intimate partner homicides and connecting victims who are in the highest danger of homicide to community-based resources. Those were the 2 main goals, and they're still the main goals when you look at the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, which is the parent company for the LAP program. It has been changed a little bit, and we'll get into some of the more details about there's some other tiers that people look into now, but those are the 2. Originally was just educating victims, identifying who might be at the most risk for lethality, and then getting those particular victims access to resources in the moment. So why are we doing lethality screens? We're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to mention just mostly like from a qualitative standpoint, like victims often will underestimate their level of danger, but they'll rarely, in my experience at least, overestimate their level of danger. So when they look at some of the studies around this, from the LAP website, from the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, they have data that shows that there's a 28 to 33% of the victims where homicide or attempted homicide was the first act of violence. So, you know, that tells me that we need to really look at a lot of factors of domestic violence relationships, not just the idea of physical abuse. We need to be looking at we're really trying to identify, right, the coercive, controlling domestic violent offenders, because the physical abuse is just one tool that they utilize against their victims. So the other idea being that we really need to connect victims with a community-based advocate in a timely manner in high danger cases. You'll see some data as we talk that Some of the majors, the initial studies that were published in 2014 about the effectiveness of this program, they were finding data that talked about only in cases they looked at, only 4% of the victims in the prior year had actually reached out to like a hotline or a women's shelter for support and services. So that was one of the things that really identified connecting victims to resources in a much more timely manner. And yes. So some data. So some of the data that they looked at from a 2014 study with Dr. Campbell and Dr. Messing and several others that have been involved in this work for many years, 44% of the abusers were arrested in the year prior to their homicide. Right. And like I said, only 4% of victims in the prior year had actually contacted domestic violence hotline or reached out for services from a shelter or a community-based support system. Sorry, I can't see my screen briefly. Okay. So between 2008 and 2013, the state of Maryland saw a 32% decrease in domestic violence related deaths. Now, they don't talk about like they can attribute that necessarily directly to then having the implementation of the LAP program in their state, but they can say it attributed to this decline they were seeing overall in the state of their intimate partner homicide. So the LAP is a three-prong approach to intimate partner violence. There's a lethality screen, which we're going to talk about is the first prong. A phone call between the law enforcement and the community-based advocate group. And then follow-up, which the follow-up we're going to just touch on briefly. That's kind of where some places have evolved. Originally, it was the original LAP screen was just going to be a lethality screen and then a follow-up phone call connecting that victim to services in the moment for safety planning, and then ideally further care from that community-based support system. The follow-up has really come out about following up on answers to some of the LAP questions so that we can follow up on anything that the victim is able to tell us about more details to get a better picture of what's going on in that particular circumstance. So we'll touch base on that a little bit more. So how it works. So the way this program is designed is that law enforcement's going to go out to a call for service. So whatever that call for service may be, that's domestic violence related. They're going to do an investigation into that particular call. Whatever, completely. The LAP program is designed to be done at the end of the investigation. So they're going to investigate their call. They're going to do whatever they need to do. And then at the end, they're going to, if they've seen what they think meets the criteria to do a LAP screen, and we'll get into more details on that as well, then they're going to talk to the victim and see if they are willing to do a LAP screen. So there's a measure of consent there as well. They can, people can decline to do this. So if they consent to do this screen, then the law enforcement officer will go through the 11 questionnaire, and it'll be in the next slide, do the LAP screen. Now, depending on their answers and depending on what happens through the course of the LAP screen, if they meet their criteria to screen in, which we'll use that in quotes, then the law enforcement officer is going to initiate a call to the victim advocate group that is designated, whether it's community-based, and in some states, in some regions in Colorado, they call it victim law enforcement victim advocate, and there's a little bit different nuance about who gets that call, but ideally it's going to be a community-based partner that's going to get a call. And then the law enforcement is going to talk briefly with the advocate that answers the phone, tell them the situation, summarize it, and then ideally the victim will then have an opportunity to talk directly to the community-based advocate, and then do some initial safety planning, and hopefully get further care set up for the next day or the next coming days, and to really start this process where that the victim starts to really work in conjunction with the law enforcement and with the community-based advocacy group, or the law enforcement-based advocacy, which also does connect with the community-based group. And we can talk more about that if people have questions about different models. So that whole process there that I just described between the law enforcement doing the screen and then getting on the phone with the advocate, and then doing a little bit of safety planning. That whole process will take anywhere from about 5 to 15 minutes. There's a role playing when you do the train the trainer on this, that it takes about 10 minutes to complete that whole process. So it doesn't add a lot of time to anything. But that's kind of the overview of like how this should work, and the time kind of that we're looking at. So it's a little bit different than some things that you're probably used to seeing.
Mark, we do have one question in the chat so far.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Priscilla was asking, how much information is law enforcement able to disclose about the situation? And I'm guessing that means maybe to either community-based or law enforcement-based victim advocates.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we can disclose as I went forward to my slides. Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, so the law enforcement officers can disclose however much as information as required. They can, there's no constraints on the law enforcement agency. So, and typically what I've seen in these is it's pretty brief about, because it's an in progress call for service. So they're usually at the house or in contact directly, a brief overview of the call for service, why they're there. And then oftentimes you'll see an advocate that will have a screen, an intake form for a lap call. And they'll have questions like, oh, they answered yes to 2, 7, and 9. So then the advocate will understand, oh, okay, they answered yes to these questions. And the law enforcement doesn't have to go over the questions. They'll just say like 2, 7, and 9 because it's already on their intake sheet. And they know what those questions are on their sheet. So there's a fair amount of discussion just briefly about what happened. If the suspect is in custody, if it's if it's depending on the nature of the call, like where we're at on the call. And then the advocate can take over doing some very specific and tailored safety planning for that particular victim. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think that it does. If not, we'll have folks, ask
Okay.
more questions in the chat. And Sabrina had shared something helpful too and wrote, law enforcement isn't bound by confidentiality.
Right.
The community-based advocate can't share information with law enforcement without an ROI, a release of information. So thanks for sharing that, Sabrina.
Yeah, that's correct. So this is the actual, this is an example of a sort of a blank lap screen. So I don't know how well you can see that, or if it's very small on your screens, but it's a series. You can see the 11 questions. So when law enforcement gets there, there's some things to fill out, officer name, employee number, case number, those kinds of details just to keep track of it. And then there's a consent, and you'll see some differences in these if you look around at different states. Some people have added things, some people have, changed some of that. But this is a one that just shows like just a checkbox if the victim agreed or consented to do this screen. And then the protocol is that you would go through this screen in order, just question 1 through 11, not changing the order because it's evidence-based, it's been researched. You have to sort of ask these questions without changing anything. And then at the end, we'll go over towards the bottom of the screen, you'll go over, did they screen in? And screening in means if they answer yes to one of the first 3 questions, then they automatically would be screened in for the referral process. And then if they don't, and those are no's, then you look at questions 4 through 11, and any 4 of those, if they answer yes to those particular questions, then they would, what would be considered screened in via the protocol. And that would mean just that the law enforcement officer is going to, in that moment, contact the advocate hotline, or whatever line is set up. And we're going to talk about the difference between like a hotline call, like for all your different agencies, or this lap line call, which some agencies utilize this in a little bit different fashion. So law enforcement would fill this out, and then this would follow that case. It gets put into whatever case file, however their records management works. And then that's going to get followed throughout that, if the case is an arrest is made and it goes through the criminal court system, then that's going to follow along with that defendant in the case file. If it's there's not enough probable cause at the time, or it's going to be in the records management system of the law enforcement agency, so that people who are accessing these records will see that there's been a lap screen done and sort of the results of that lap screen. So some people that might see that would be obviously the district attorney if there's arrest and criminal side, judges, probation officers, bond commissioners, defense attorneys will also have access to these, defendants will know, and then treatment providers as well when we start looking at the long-term ramifications and, you know, agreements and plea deals and things like that, and requirements made by the court system. This lap screen can kind of follow that defendant, so they know at least some background about the relationship with this particular victim, as well as sort of what was the status, at least on this particular incident at this point in time.
Mark, we have another question.
Okay.
Let's see. Russia was asking, is there a list of which jurisdictions in the state use the lap screen?
Yeah, so I was, yes, we'll cover that in just a little bit, but yes, there is a list. There's not a list that's formally that everyone would have access to, but I'm aware of like what, I mean, I shouldn't say I'm 100% aware, but I have, from what I understand, a very good understanding of like where the lap has been utilized currently in the state of Colorado. And we're going to get to that in just a little bit, if we could just hold on for just a little bit.
Yeah, great. And then another question, Julie asked, is the lap in the quote, new world software?
I'm not sure what you mean by new world software.
Yeah, I am not either. Julie, could you give us a little more context?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So I met with the past police chief, local police chief, and he said if we could get our we don't call it lap, but I like the lap, it looks good, screening into the new world software that all the law enforcement agencies have to use, that they're putting data into, then they would be kind of required to use it, because that's our problem is some of our law enforcement agencies in Garfield County don't see the value of it. So, but I'd like to talk with you, Mark, later. Seriously.
No, yeah, certainly. That brings up that's a larger issue, right? And there is, you know, some communities really, I mean, are trying to get it like just for the report writing systems that law enforcement use. Some are trying to get it like embedded into that report writing system, so it would just come up into their report writing templates. So there's different strategies that different agencies use. So there's not like one necessarily, but I can talk later to anyone that's interested about like, you know, different strategies to try to get better. And that's part of my job, is to try to connect with law enforcement and get them on board with utilizing the lap. I mean, that's one of the biggest things with my current role. So. All right. So when do we do a lethality screen? We touch base. There is kind of a standard that was identified by Maryland back when they first started looking at this, and they've referred to it as the manifestation of danger in an intimate partner relationship. And we'll go over what that definition is. And so when do we look at doing a lap? So when you believe there's been an assault or other act of domestic violence, okay, when you believe the victim or survivor faces danger once you leave, which is one of the criteria when we start looking at dual arrest situations, and by the state statute for law enforcement to look at, you know, different criteria for dual arrest standards. That's one of the things, you know, when we leave, what's the danger level that victim is going to be potentially facing. And then when you have a situation where we go to a repeated home or repeated individuals that we have history of domestic violence with, we know that we regularly go out and protect these parties, that also can trigger a lap protocol. The other one that's not on there is also just an officer's instinct as well. Like they can refer somebody into the protocol at any moment if they feel like it meets whatever criteria. They can refer that in as well. So there's a fair amount of discretion, but there is some formal sort of when we would do a lap screen. So I wanted to touch base just a little bit on this idea about a hotline, which when I say hotline, that refers to like probably the number that anyone would call and access services at your different groups or different shelters or different organizations. And then the LAP line, which will kind of differentiate the two. So on a hotline call, it's usually initiated with a victim's calling the hotline to get information about their particular circumstance or to talk to somebody about their situation, whether that's initiated by themselves or a friend and family's calling for one of their loved ones or something of that matter. There's not as much time constraints on those types of calls, and at least from my, limited knowledge around how those work, but being around and working with several shelters closely for a number of years, it seemed like there was less time constraints on those types of services. On a LAP line, that is usually can be a very dynamic situation, and it's an in-progress case where law enforcement's in contact with somebody that's reporting a particular case of domestic violence, investigating that, and then following up with this LAP screen, where they are then initiating a call to the advocacy, to whoever their advocate group happens to be, to field those calls. So, and then you're having a conversation between the law enforcement officer and the advocate about this particular case, and then ideally having then that victim on the phone with the advocate to get some really tailored safety planning and some next steps in place to assist that individual in their particular circumstance. So, and those calls are, like I said, is a shorter call in duration. We're just, putting a little triage on it, getting them some in the moment planning, and then hopefully getting them connected for further care down the road. So those are kind of the difference. And I'll talk briefly about the hotline versus the LAP line. So some agencies like Connecticut, I've done a lot of work, or not a lot, but I've done a fair amount of work with the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They're the ones that we've kind of started to base our Colorado program off of, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail on that. They have a statewide, so all of their coalitions are, their domestic violence coalition is the sort of the program manager of the LAP program for the entire state. And all of their member agencies have a specific line that law enforcement would call to reach their agency, to reach the advocates when it's a LAP call, versus they also have a hotline that everyone's going to be able to call 24 hours a day as well. So they differentiate. A lot of places will differentiate that, so they don't tie up their hotline with a LAP call and vice versa. So they have the freedom to still answer many different types of calls.
Mark, we have a question in the chat.
Sure. Yeah.
Susie asked that they didn't see a question on the tool about this, on the LAP tool, but in their experience, when a perpetrator has threatened, hurt, or killed animals or pets, it seems like things are getting very dangerous for the victim or victims. Does the research support adding a question on the LAP tool about this?
Just from my experience, that is a good indicator of certainly being in a dangerous situation. However, I'm not sure what research has been done as far as like adding that to the LAP screen. I know it was not done in the original like sort of research around it, but I don't know if it's been done. I haven't seen anything since that's been done with that, but I don't know if that's something that someone is looking into. And there are going to be some, we can talk in a little bit about some changes to the Maryland model a little bit. They are changing that. Actually, this should be coming out soon, but they are changing a little bit, but not around the idea about animal cruelty and that kind of lethality risk. So some of the key steps that have been kind of identified through some of the research that's been done is for the victim advocate fielding this LAP call is obviously gaining, building rapport and like every one of us probably does in our world quickly with victims, is gaining victims' trust, gaining some rapport, reinforcing the information that they were told by the law enforcement officer about the danger that victim is in, and then educating that victim and providing some timely and immediate safety planning and maybe other resources as well, depending on the situation. And then actively encouraging the victim to come in for further services. That's really the crux of what they're trying to do when they initiate these LAP screens, is they really want to get a better connection from the victim to the community-based advocates, and then getting them into further services. So excuse me, I'm just going to get a drink of water real quick. So then we'll talk about some variables affecting participation that they've kind of seen as they go through and look at some of this data. So the severe violence of the incident can have kind of a, we'll say, a positive effect, which meaning that they'll, participate in the lap screen, they'll talk to an advocate later, is what I mean by like a positive effect. So just the nature of the particular incident that the law enforcement officer might be called to can have a positive effect on that, depending on the violence of it. If a weapon was used during that call for service, there's a greater chance of having a positive effect on that with participation. And then if they had previously participated in some type of informal protective actions from the victim standpoint, that has been seen to show like a positive effect on utilizing the lap screen, talking to an advocate afterwards. As well as if a victim had a prior experience working with domestic violence service providers, that was kind of 50-50 whether it influenced their participation or not. One of the things they did identify as like a negative effect was if the particular incident that the law enforcement gets called out to has triggered PTSD symptoms in the victim, then that can have kind of a negative effect on like further participation, whether they complete a screen or talk to an advocate or things of those two prongs. So. All right, so some of the data, because people usually ask, well, how many, how many screens would actually screen in, or how many calls can we anticipate at an agency receiving? So roughly, I can give you some rough ideas about how that kind of generally looks. And it seems like from what I've seen around the country, it does kind of generally play out like this. Like, so let's say you had 1,000 domestic violence calls to a particular law enforcement agency. Probably if you did a lap screen and work through that protocol on all 1,000 of those, you're going to bet about 500 to 600, so 50 to 60% are going to screen in, meaning that there's a significant lethality risk posed by that offender against that victim. And then of those, so of that 50 or 60% that screen in, you'll probably get another 50 to 60% that will participate and agree to speak with an advocate. And then of those that I've seen this number be upwards in the 40%, and Connecticut has some higher numbers that are sort of, in what I've seen, really skewed. But about 30% to even 40% or so of those victims that actually talk to an advocate will then go in for further services. And so there's some data collection that goes along, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we start talking about this, to sort of how this implementation looks briefly. So talk a little bit about the LAP program in Colorado. So Colorado's had LAP in the state for a little over 5 years. It really started down in Douglas County. They were the first county. They're still utilizing it today. They were the first county to really bring in LAP, and that was a little over 5 years ago. They've been the only sort of the major county using it. Routt County up in Steamboat and some of the sister agencies up there have also been using it for equally amount of time. Those are the two main ones that have had consistently use of the LAP program. And then now we got a grant, or we didn't, but like the Colorado Post and the Attorney General's office through the Department of Law received a grant at the end of 2021 to bring in my position, which is a coordinator position, to try to bring the LAP on a larger scale into Colorado. So now through that, Boulder County and 7 out of the 8 law enforcement agencies and both domestic violence shelter groups are utilizing the LAP program in Boulder County. I'm still working through some implementation, so that's growing. And then there's other counties that have contacted me, and we're working through like bringing it into their agencies. And we'll talk through like sort of what that looks like as well. So one thing that, at least from my experience, what was identified is, when I talk to a lot of like community-based advocacy groups and different advocates, a lot of domestic violence programs, as many of you know, use some type of lethality screen, whether it's a danger assessment or whether it's something else that they do on intake or at some point when they are working with their client base. So, but, from my experience, law enforcement really does not do the majority of law enforcement doesn't do any kind of formal lethality screen. They do lots of like informal screening for risk assessment, lots of things that are informal, but there's not really like a formal process for any kind of lethality screen in the majority when you look at the state. So some, like I said, the ones that are using it already, and then some agencies use different lethality screens. There are a few different lethality screens that other agencies utilize, and there's some really good work being done around some of those as well. So, but by and large, it's just not something that's used on a formal basis. So we primarily are looking at basing it on the Connecticut model that they use, which is based on the Maryland model of the original lab screen. Connecticut's been doing this since 2012. They have 100% of their state utilizing the lab screen. So every law enforcement agency and every member organization of the Domestic Violence Coalition there use the lab screen. It's a pretty robust system. Their backup system. So when you call a hotline in Connecticut, when the officer calls the lap line for their particular like local domestic violence group, if they don't answer for some reason, that call will be forwarded directly to the state domestic violence program, who then has someone answer, helps triage and work with that particular victim, and then refers them to the local agency. So they have a pretty good system. They have a law enforcement coordinator as part of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence there, and that's who runs the entire program. It's a pretty interesting system, and no one's ever seen it, but they have a lot of information on their website that you can go to and check out as well. And they also use, what I think is interesting there is that probation and other entities within the court system are also using the same languaging and the same LAP protocol, so that everyone is kind of speaking the same language when we start following an offender through the court system, which I think is kind of an interesting concept, that there isn't this different model that they use. They use the same kind of protocol to evaluate lethality risk throughout different processes there. All right, so some of the goals of this program, and these are just a few of the goals. Obviously, we're trying to decrease inter-department homicide in Colorado through the utilization of this program. Okay. I also think one of the main ripple effects that you're going to see as we get more communities and more agencies utilizing this tool is it's going to overall increase the level of domestic violence investigations being conducted. I think that's a really big ripple effect from the screening process as well. Holding offenders accountable, obviously, is a goal from like the law enforcement perspective, but we want to also, that's one of the things we want to try to do. Increasing overall community safety. And the other big thing that I'd like to highlight here is the other ripple effect of this idea about, increasing the teamwork between all of our agencies. The most effective and the best cases I can remember when I look back at my time as a detective and working on domestic violence cases was when I worked with social services and I worked with the local domestic violence shelter and the victim advocates, insulating around building this like insulated bubble around that particular victim. Those were some of the most successful and the best cases that I can remember, and some of the most enjoyable from a standpoint of like, it's a teamwork around this person that we might have all different perspectives, and we have different goals and we have different ideas, but we're all trying to insulate and get this victim into either a better place so that they can have a better and more, realize their greatest potential, right? That's what, I think that's what we're all trying to do. And so increasing the teamwork, I think, is a really good ripple effect from this lap screen, with the teamwork that it takes between the advocates and the law enforcement, that they're a team. It's not two different entities. They're just a team supporting this victim in that moment of, in that moment of crisis that they are currently navigating. So obviously, one of the main goals from the state bringing in this is that we want to promote this throughout the state, so that if you're in Summit County or you're in Pueblo or you're in Boulder or you're in Denver, there's some consistent level of investigation and care that's being done with that victim. And this can and this is through like the LAP program. It's also, some agencies are already doing some of this work with other screens and doing it in their county. So I just want to also enhance that we're just enhancing what they're already doing.
Mark, we have another question in the
Sure.
chat. Let's see, Sabrina's asking, Colorado's DV deaths, 91 people, and that's, I'm
Yep.
assuming referencing the recent report that came out for
Yes.
2022, spiked 44% in 2021. No contact order is issued when charges are filed, but is often violated without repercussion. When lethality risk is high, are there any additional sanctions on the perpetrator, such as mental health support and removal of weapons to reduce risk? This sounds like a more general question, maybe not LAP specific, but do you have any thoughts that you want to share on that?
Sure. I mean, I'd have to talk to like the prosecutors a little bit more, but just from my experience with that, like, yeah, I mean, firearm relinquishment, I mean, it's supposed to be a part of all those processes, whether it's a criminal process or a civil process. There are steps, and I know that was I really identified this year in the latest Fatality Review Board report that just came out, that the firearm relinquishment question and issue of how do we actually enforce that? What are communities doing with that? Is I think that's going to be something they're really going to start to tackle. As far as like get more consistency with how that's being done. But that is supposed to be part of all the processes, whether it's a civil restraining order or whether it's a criminal restraining order, and you know, finding out about firearm access, because in that same report, you know, all of the, I think, well, not all, but like almost all, like over 80% of the, you know, cases that were viewed involve firearms. So I know that that's one of the main goals that's going to be coming up moving forward from that group. So I lost the first part of that question.
Let's see, I think it was more just kind of setting the stage and then asking about when risk is high, what are those sanctions? So I think you can.
Yeah, so I know from a prosecutor standpoint, I know like the Boulder County prosecutors, I can speak to them because I've done more of my work with those directly. They're using the lab to really argue for different sanctions, whether that's some sort of monitoring, some sort of counseling. They're trying to utilize the fact that, okay, we have this individual, they score really high on a lab screen, and we would like to see some other sanctions involved. Now, the success rate they're having, I know they're also talking about, you know, there's some, you know, judges training and education as well around these things and what it means, which is something that, you know, will be part of what I'm also looking at, trying to do some of that education around the state as well. So they are utilizing it. I just couldn't tell you, like, you know, what kind of effect they're having.
Thanks for answering that. And also we have some legislation that we'll be keeping an eye on this session to see how things, you know, support that as well.
Yes, exactly. All right, so some of the benefits that we can talk about with this LAP is, you know, obviously one of the main things is educating victims, you know, their family and friends as well, and law enforcement as well, about the danger that this particular offender may present to that particular situation, right? So that's a big piece. Is a lot of times the victims, you know, they may not realize the level of danger, right? Because they often will underestimate that, but then they hear law enforcement, or they hear the advocates talking about it, and it does change it when it's kind of a formalized process. People have seen that does change something for the victims a little bit. Also, connecting victims directly to services and trying to get people in quicker. So I think they've seen, and they don't have data on this, but like when I talk to the members of Connecticut that have done some training out here for me, they talk about, you know, instead of, you know, that misdemeanor domestic violence call that the officers get called out on, it's, you know, the overall call for service is like, you know, in the grand scheme of like charging an arrest is maybe a minor infraction of something. It's a misdemeanor crime, but that misdemeanor crime leads to a lapse screen that identifies this person has been dealing with so much more than what this misdemeanor crime shows, that they get connected to services, and they are accelerating their process to then ultimately, hopefully, if they choose to, obviously, get away from that particular offender, instead of waiting till there's a really violent case. And that's when they intersect and they get a lapse screen, and then they get that. So I think Connecticut is seen without, they have a pretty major report that's going to be coming out. They have a researcher with the name escapes me, that is with, I want to say, the University of Connecticut. They're doing a major study on sort of the effectiveness of the LAP program, and should be released this year sometime. So I'm interested to see what they're seeing, but qualitatively, they're kind of seeing that they're accelerating that process to get the victim doesn't, we don't have to wait till something really bad has happened before this is engaged. We can get it early on, hopefully. So then they have an overall, we overall are decreasing a woman's exposure to violence, and we're promoting a lot more protective actions. So some of the benefits, and there's others, but this is a snapshot of what, of kind of what the LAP program is kind of overview. And my contact will be on the end for people that want to talk a lot more about it or get into more details about it. I will certainly welcome any conversations with that. So the way implementation kind of works, just to give everyone a snapshot on sort of how this program works, is we'll do a community readiness. So I have a community readiness form we'll send out to the communities that might be interested in this. And the real key steps are having a law enforcement agency and then having a partner domestic violence agency to be partners in this, and then having the access for 24-hour victim advocacy, so that all law enforcement can call at 2 a.m. and get somebody to then do a LAP screen. That's really those are the real big critical steps when you look at a community readiness. Then there's an application. There's a very brief application to get signatures on, which will ultimately be an MOU agreement between like myself as the state coordinator and then the different agencies involved in this. And you can have like, maybe it's all of your law enforcement agencies, or maybe it's just one in your county who is partnering with this. And they will have like their chief or their executive director sign, so that this is going to be a really good commitment from the entire agency to get involved with this. And then we'll set up a train the trainer event. And what we do there is we come in, and I would come in with probably some other trainers as well. And we do it's somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of a train the trainer event for identified like key stakeholders in that community with all the agencies involved. So it could be a couple domestic violence advocacy groups. It could be several law enforcement agencies. Those people will be the like point people at their agency for this program. We'll do a 1 day, maybe not quite a 1 day, but a 1 day training roughly, to give them all the materials they need. We give them the train the trainer. We give them implementation training material, forms, all that they can then change, put their logos on, put their specific hotline numbers on that they would like to use. So we provide all that material to the agencies, and then they go out as trainers and they will implement that and train, do the briefing trainings or however it looks. Probably a briefing training. Usually it's a little longer briefing training to train officers, and then train the advocates that are going to be fielding the calls on the other end. So both entities will receive training. Then they will be implemented in their community. And then the implementation can take a while to get, everyone on board. It's depending on, how their agency works and all the different nuances that go on. And then I support that with technical support. I can come down in person some. I can also jump on the phone with some of the point people and really help navigate through implementation. And then we're working on data collection so that we can really we could really see how you can really see a lot when you look at how the screens are being done from the data you're getting from the screens. And so there's different methods out there. Connecticut has a really robust system that they pay for, and it's really well done. We're just so new here in Colorado. I'm working on some of that programming behind the scenes right now is what I'm currently trying to figure out, the data collection piece. So there's more to come on that. So to get involved, really is contacting me, and I'm going to throw up my my email. I'm going to throw up my email here. This is a LAP email I sort of started generically. So that gets to me. It goes directly to me. So if anyone wants to follow up with me directly, has specific questions, maybe outside, the time we have for today, but we can, I can get in touch, and then we'll go from there and start conversations. So that's the bulk of what I have for today. So there's about 10 minutes left, so we can open it up to any other questions or anything else that people want to bring up.
Thanks so much, Mark. This has been great information, and just want to remind folks that A, you can type in the chat, or B, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, whatever you prefer. And then we will also send out a copy of the slides with the recording. So you will all get that as well, and that'll have Mark's contact info as well. So does anybody have any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat. I'll give people a moment. While we have one question from Priscilla. How can we find out if our county is implementing LAP?
I could probably tell you. I have all the counties labeled, and I've done a lot of phone calls and research, as much as I can tell, like where LAP has been implemented. So if you email me, I could just, I can tell you.
Okay, and we had a couple great, offering some kudos to you, Mark, for a great program, great presentation. And then a question of what is the accuracy, Benjamin's asking, what is the accuracy of LAP? For example, false positives, and accuracy compared to that of the danger assessment upon which the LAP is based.
So the LAP is really sensitive in the meaning that, like, so I think there was a slide, and I don't think I mentioned it. So when they look back at like fatalities, domestic violence related fatalities, from period of like, I think it was like 2008 to 2013, when they look back at those cases that where they knew homicides had happened, and then they did a LAP screen on those cases with the facts that they knew, 92% of those offenders would have been identified. So that was kind of, it's over 90% as far as their sensitivity rate. So it's a really sensitive thing. So you're actually, that's why you get a large amount of people screening into the protocol. Doesn't mean they're, you know, we're going to have that kind of like, you know, they're necessarily not all those people are going to go out and commit those types of violent crimes, but they have the red flags in their background that there's, you know, there's a potential there. And then so the false positive rate, I don't know if I can compare that really to the danger assessment. I haven't looked too much at like how does it compare to the danger assessment versus the numbers that they were seeing with the specific LAP program. I know how it kind of compares to some other lethality assessments, but it's really sensitive. So a lot of people, it has a high screen-in rate, I guess I'll say. So.
All right, well, while folks are thinking about any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and pop up our poll here, and
okay.
It's anonymous. So folks, if you wouldn't mind answering, there's 3 questions here, and I'll leave this open for a little bit.
And if it's I think, Brandy, I'll stop sharing my screen if everyone's good there.
Sure, that's absolutely okay.
Okay.
All right, we have some thank yous in the chat. And again, if folks have questions, you can contact Mark directly, or you can type them here in the chat or unmute yourself. I will go ahead and leave this poll up just for a few more seconds. I appreciate you all taking the time. I know that some of you have seen this poll many times, but we like to be consistent and make sure that we're measuring things in a way that is supportive to all of you too. So thank you all for asking awesome questions and for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and end our poll. Let's see. And that shares out the results, I think, with all of you. And let's see. And my apologies, I'm sharing this and we need to take our own little photos of them. So it's our little. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for being here. I'm not seeing other questions in the chat, so we can go ahead and wrap up a few minutes early. Again, thanks so much, Mark, for sharing all this wonderful information and giving people a contact point, contact person, and also a frame of reference for how you're building the LAP program here in Colorado. Sounds like it's exciting that it's growing. Also, thank you to all of you for participating, for asking awesome questions, and thank you to our interpreters as well. thank you all for being here. We'll have our next Facts and Snacks webinar will be in February on the 14th. We're going to be speaking with someone from Cobalt, C-O-B-A-L-T, and that person will talk to us a little bit about their abortion funding. So keep an eye out for information about that. Also in February, we have some human trafficking webinars that we are going to be talking to some panels of folks about human trafficking. So keep an eye out for those announcements as well. Thank you all so much. Thanks again, Mark. Really appreciate you being here, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop our